I thought Daniel Cross hated me for exactly 14 months before he kissed me in the middle of a company gala with 200 people watching, and if you'd told me on my first day that this was where we'd end up, I would have laughed you out of the building. Let me back up. I was 25, an executive assistant at Cross Meridian, the kind of firm where everyone whispered the CEO's name like it was a weather warning. Daniel Cross. Ice in a suit. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. He'd just look at a mistake on a page, go quiet for 3 full seconds, and somehow that silence did more damage than any shouting match ever could. People flinched when his office door opened. I used to flinch too in the beginning. My job, on paper, was simple. Manage his calendar. Handle his correspondence. Keep his coffee exactly the temperature he liked it, which was somehow always wrong no matter what I did. In practice, my job was absorbing every bit of pressure that rolled downhill from the top floor and making sure it never touched anyone else. I was good at it. I was invisible in the way that mattered everywhere, noticed by no one, especially not by him. For the first year, Daniel Cross barely looked at me twice. He'd hand me a folder without eye contact. He'd say reschedule it instead of please and walk off before I could even nod. I told myself it wasn't personal. I told myself a lot of things that first year to keep from feeling small. Then came the Weston deal. It was the biggest acquisition the company had chased in 3 years, and 2 days before the final signing, our lead negotiator quit without warning, walked out over some dispute nobody would explain to me, and left an entire deal room's worth of half-finished paperwork sitting on nobody's desk. I found it at 9 p.m., long after I should have gone home, because I'd stayed late reorganizing his calendar for the next quarter. I read through it. I shouldn't have. It wasn't my job. But something in the terms didn't sit right. A clause buried on page 11 that gutted our exit protections if Weston's revenue dipped below a certain line, and I just knew, nobody senior had caught it yet. I typed up a 2-page memo at midnight, flagged the clause, suggested a fix, and left it on Daniel's desk before I left the building, mostly because I figured nothing would come of it and I'd feel better having tried. At 7 the next morning, my phone rang. It was him. My office, he said. Now. I walked in expecting to get fired for touching documents above my clearance. Instead, he was standing at the window with the memo in his hand, and when he turned around, his face had an expression I'd never seen on him before. Not warmth exactly. Attention. Real attention, like I'd finally become a person in the room instead of furniture. Who told you to read this, he said. Nobody. Who told you the fix? I did. He looked at the page again, then at me, longer this time. It's right, he said, like that fact personally offended him. How long have you worked here? 14 months. And nobody's used you for anything real in 14 months. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, which turned out to be the correct answer, because he nodded once like I'd passed some test I didn't know I was taking, and said, "You're in the room for the Weston call. 10 o'clock. Don't say anything unless I ask you something directly." That was it. No thank you. No explanation. Just a door opening that I hadn't even known existed. I sat through that call with my hands folded in my lap, watching Daniel Cross work. I'd seen him cold before, plenty of times, but I'd never seen him sharp like that, cutting through Weston's lawyers with questions that made them stumble over their own numbers. Halfway through, one of their people tried to slide past the exact clause I'd flagged, and Daniel didn't even glance at his notes. Page 11, he said. Walk me through the revenue floor again. The lawyer hesitated. That hesitation told us everything. Daniel caught my eye across the table for exactly 1 second, and something passed between us that felt bigger than it should have for 1 second of eye contact in a conference room full of strangers. The deal closed 2 days later, cleaner than anyone expected, and Daniel Cross started using me differently after that. Not warmly, not right away, but differently. He started saying, "Have Claire look at it first," before decisions went out. He started asking my opinion in meetings, brief and direct, the kind of question that expected a real answer, not a polite one. Other people noticed before I was ready for them to. My coworker Priya, who used to grab lunch with me twice a week, started asking pointed questions about why I was in the strategy meetings now. A director named Foster made a comment in the break room that he thought was quiet enough that I wouldn't hear it, something about girls who know how to get noticed by the right people, and I felt my face go hot for the rest of that afternoon. I told myself I didn't care what they thought. That was mostly a lie. But I cared more about the fact that for the first time since I'd started at that company, I felt like I actually mattered to the work, and I wasn't ready to give that up just because people wanted to whisper about why. The late nights started piling up after that. Daniel worked later than anyone, later than the cleaning crew most nights, and somewhere in the second month after Weston, I stopped leaving when my contract said I could and started staying because he needed a second set of eyes on something, or because a client call ran long, or because he'd walk out of his office at 8:30 and just say, "You're still here," like it surprised him every single time even though it kept happening. One of those nights, he ordered food he never touched and slid the bag toward me instead. "Eat something," he said. "I'm fine." That wasn't a suggestion. I ate. We sat at opposite ends of the same table, him reading through contracts, me color-coding a merger timeline, and for a while neither of us said anything, and it didn't feel uncomfortable the way silence with him used to feel. It felt like something had shifted underneath both of us without either of us naming it out loud. "Why do you work this hard?" I asked him, somewhere around 9, when the office outside his glass walls had gone completely dark. He didn't look up right away. "Because if I stop pushing, everyone under me stops pushing twice as fast, and I built this company from nothing. I don't get to slow down first." That sounds lonely. That got him to look up. Just for a second, something flickered behind his eyes, something that looked almost like surprise that I'd said it out loud. "It is," he said, and went back to his contract like the admission cost him something. I started noticing small things after that. The way he rubbed the back of his neck when a call went badly. The way he always ordered the same black coffee even though I knew for a fact he hated the taste, because his father had drunk it black and some part of him had never let that go. He never told me that directly. I pieced it together from things he said in passing, the way you learn a person by accident when you're paying closer attention than you're supposed to. The rumors got worse before they got better. By the third month, half the office had a theory about why Claire Bennett kept getting pulled into rooms she had no business being in. Nobody said it to my face, mostly, except for Foster, who seemed to enjoy finding new ways to say it sideways. "Must be nice," he told me once in the elevator, in that tone that meant the opposite, having the boss's ear like that. I didn't answer him. I'd learned that answering just gave people more to chew on. But it started to wear on me anyway, the way people's faces changed when I walked into a room, the way conversations stopped a half-second too late for me not to notice. I brought it up to Daniel exactly once, late on a Thursday when we were the last two people on the floor. "People think there's something going on," I said. I hadn't planned to say it. It just came out while I was packing up my bag. He didn't look surprised. "I know." "You know? Claire, I run a company with 400 employees. People talk about everything. I stopped listening to it years ago." He paused, and something in his jaw tightened. "Does it bother you?" "Sometimes." He was quiet for a second too long. "It bothers me too," he said finally, "just not for the reason you'd think." I didn't ask him what he meant by that. I wasn't sure I was ready for the answer yet, and some part of me suspected he wasn't ready to give it either. Things kept building after that, quietly, the way real things do, not the movie kind of building where there's one big moment and suddenly everyone knows. It was smaller than that. It was him remembering I took my coffee with 2 sugars without ever being told twice. It was me learning to read the specific silence that meant he was about to lose his temper in a meeting, and finding the exact sentence that would keep it from happening. It was him starting to say we instead of I when he talked about decisions that used to only ever belong to him. The turning point, the real one, came in April at the Ashford negotiation. Ashford Logistics was a company Daniel had been chasing for 2 years, the kind of deal that would double our shipping division overnight, and their CEO, a man named Terrence Vale, had a reputation for using meetings as theater. He liked audiences. He liked making people uncomfortable in front of other people, and he'd specifically requested a larger table for our final session, which Daniel took, correctly, as a warning shot. I was in the room that day, technically there to manage logistics, but somewhere around the 90-minute mark, Vale turned his attention to me directly, the way certain men do when they want to knock someone off balance without ever raising their voice. "And what exactly does Miss Bennett contribute to a negotiation like this?" he said, smiling at the table like it was a joke everyone was in on. The room went quiet in that specific corporate way where everyone's face stays perfectly still because they already know the temperature just dropped. I opened my mouth to answer him myself. I didn't need saving. But before I could get a single word out, Daniel set his pen down, slow and deliberate, the way he did right before he dismantled someone. "She caught the revenue clause that saved this company $11 million on the Weston deal," he said, not raising his voice at all, which somehow made it land harder. "So if you want to keep this meeting productive, I'd suggest asking her opinion instead of questioning why she's in the room." Vale's smile went thin. Nobody at that table said another word about it for the rest of the session, and by the end of the day, the deal terms had shifted almost entirely in our favor. Afterward, in the elevator down, just the two of us, I finally said what I'd been holding in since the meeting. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did. I can handle Vale. I've handled worse." "I know you can." He looked at me then, and there was something in his face I hadn't seen before, something that had stopped being careful. "That's not why I did it." The elevator doors opened before I could ask him what he meant, and neither of us said anything else on the walk to the parking garage, but something had shifted between us that day, something we both felt, and neither one of us was ready to name. May was when it finally cracked open. It was a Friday night, late, both of us the only ones left on the executive floor again, prepping for a shareholder call that had been moved up without warning. I was exhausted in the specific way that makes your hands feel disconnected from your body, and at some point around 11, I looked up from my laptop and caught him watching me instead of the document in front of him. "What?" I said. "Nothing." He looked back down, but not fast enough. "Daniel." He set the folder aside completely, which he never did, not with a deadline looming, and leaned back in his chair like he was giving himself permission to say something he'd been holding onto for a while. "You've stopped being careful around me," he said. "Is that a problem?" "No." His voice had gone quieter than I'd ever heard it. "It's the opposite of a problem." My heart was doing something strange and fast in my chest. "Then what is it?" He stood up, slow, and came around the desk instead of staying safely behind it, which felt like its own kind of statement. "I've spent 14 months telling myself this was about the work," he said. "That I kept pulling you into rooms because you were good, because you were sharp, because you caught things nobody else caught. All of that's true." He stopped a few feet from me, close enough that the air in the room felt different than it had 5 minutes earlier. "It's just not the whole truth." I didn't move. I wasn't sure I could have if I tried. "What's the rest of it?" I asked, and my voice came out smaller than I meant it to. "The rest of it," he said, is that I look for reasons to keep you in the room, Claire. I have for months. And I've told myself that was fine because it was professional, because it was about confidence, until I stopped believing that a while ago and kept saying it anyway. The office was completely silent except for the hum of the building's ventilation and the sound of my own pulse in my ears. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because Vale looked at you like you didn't belong in that room, and I realized I was angrier about that than I've been about anything in years, and it wasn't because it threatened the deal." He looked at me steady, the way he looked at contracts he'd already decided to sign. "It was because somebody disrespected you, and I wanted to put my fists through the table." I laughed, a little shaky, because it was that or something else entirely. "That's not exactly professional of you." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." Neither of us said anything else for a long moment. Then he reached out, slow enough that I could have stepped back if I wanted to, and tucked a piece of hair behind my ear, his hand lingering there a second longer than it needed to. I didn't step back. "Claire," he said, quiet, almost careful, like he was checking whether the ground beneath us was actually solid. "Yeah," I said, and that was as close to permission as either of us needed. He kissed me right there in his office, late on a Friday night with the city lights bleeding through the windows behind him, and it wasn't rushed or clumsy. It was exactly like him, deliberate, certain. Like he'd already made the decision a while ago and was just finally acting on it. When he pulled back, he kept his forehead close to mine. "This complicates things," I said, a little breathless. "Everything worth having is complicated," he said. I stopped being afraid of that a long time ago. We kept it quiet after that, mostly, the way two people do when they both understand exactly how much is at stake if it comes out wrong. I still did my job. He still ran the company like the machine he'd built it to be. But something had softened underneath all of it, something only the two of us could feel, in the way he'd rest a hand briefly on my shoulder walking past my desk, in the way I started staying later not because the job demanded it, but because I wanted the last hour of the day to be the one where it was just us. It couldn't stay quiet forever. Nothing that real ever does. The company gala came at the end of June, the biggest event of the year, the kind where every major client, every board member, every reporter who covered the industry showed up in one room to watch Cross Meridian perform its own success. I'd worked 11 of these events as staff, standing near the edges with a clipboard, invisible in the way I used to be invisible everywhere. This one was different before it even started, because Daniel asked me to walk in with him instead of arriving separately like we always had. "People will talk," I told him in the car. "People have been talking for months," he said. "I'm tired of pretending I care what Foster from finance thinks about my personal life." We walked in together, and I felt every set of eyes in that ballroom find us at once, the way a room does when something doesn't match the story people had already written in their heads. Priya's eyebrows went up. Foster's mouth actually fell open for a second before he caught himself. I held my head up anyway, because for the first time in 14 months, I wasn't the assistant slipping in through a side door. I was standing next to him, and it felt like finally exhaling after holding my breath for over a year. The evening went the way these things always did: speeches, applause, a slideshow of the year's numbers projected on a screen 20 feet wide. Daniel gave his remarks the way he always did, sharp and controlled, thanking the board, thanking the staff, laying out the vision for the next year in a voice that made 200 people lean forward in their seats. Then, right at the end, he paused. "There's one more thing," he said, and something in his voice had changed, gone from executive to something rawer underneath it. "For 14 months, this company has run better than it ever has, and most of you assume that's because of decisions I made in that boardroom." He looked out at the crowd, and then, deliberately, found me standing near the edge of the stage. "It's not. A lot of the credit belongs to someone most of you walked past in the hallway 100 times without ever really seeing her. The room had gone quiet in that particular way that means everyone already senses something is about to happen. Claire Bennett caught an $11 million mistake before it ever left this building, he said. She's been in every room that mattered for the last year, and I should have told all of you that a long time ago instead of letting people whisper about why. I felt my face go hot, felt every eye in the room swing toward me at once, and before I could process any of it, Daniel stepped down off the small stage, crossed the floor in front of everyone, the board, the clients, the reporters. Foster standing frozen near the bar with his drink halfway to his mouth, and stopped right in front of me. I should have said this months ago too, he said, quiet enough that it was only for me, even though the whole room was watching. I don't care anymore who talks about it. Then he kissed me, right there in front of 200 people, in front of the board, in front of every single person who'd ever whispered about why the boss's assistant kept getting pulled into rooms she supposedly didn't belong in. The room went completely silent for one full second. Then somebody near the back started clapping, and it spread through the whole ballroom fast, like the room had been waiting for permission to stop pretending it hadn't already figured this out. I pulled back just enough to see his face, and for the first time since I'd met him, Daniel Cross looked completely unguarded, no ice left in him at all, just something warm and certain and a little relieved that he'd finally said it out loud. You planned that, I said, my voice shaking somewhere between laughing and crying. I've been planning that for months, he admitted. I just needed the right room to finally stop caring what anyone else thought. Foster wouldn't meet my eyes for the rest of the night. Priya practically ran across the room to grab my arm, half stunned, half thrilled, whispering that she'd known something was different for weeks and just hadn't wanted to say anything. I barely heard her. I was still looking at Daniel, still feeling the echo of that kiss, still trying to fold the last 14 months into something that made sense with the man standing in front of me now. Later that night, after the crowd had thinned and the caterers had started clearing glasses, we stood near the windows overlooking the city, the same view he'd had from his office the night everything started to shift between us. Any regrets? He asked, his hand finding mine. About the $11 million memo, or the part where you kissed me in front of the entire board? Either. I looked out at the skyline, then back at him, at the man who'd spent a year pretending he didn't notice me until the night he finally couldn't pretend anymore. None, I said. Not one. He smiled, actually smiled, the kind I'd only seen a handful of times in 14 months, and pulled me closer against the cool glass and the city lights spread out beneath us like the whole thing had been leading here all along. I thought Daniel Cross hated me for 14 months. It turned out he'd just been too careful with something he didn't want to get wrong, and once he finally stopped being careful, he made sure the entire room knew exactly how wrong I'd been about him from the very start.